Vladimir Putin seems immovable as his country faces unprecedented and severe economic sanctions.
Результаты своих собственных ошибок пытаются свалить на нас.
Putin is warning the West those sanctions will backfire and send prices in their own countries through the roof. He says Russia's economy will, quote, adapt and emerge stronger. Vladimir Milov is a former Russian deputy minister of energy. Since leaving the Russian government in 2002, he's become a vocal critic of Putin. He joins us from Lithuania. Hi, Mr. Milov. Good to meet you. Thank you for joining our program.
My pleasure.
I wanted to first ask you about an observation some analysts are making about Vladimir Putin and the degree to which he is perhaps surprised by the strength of the Ukrainian resistance. Do you think it's accurate to say he would be surprised by that?
I think he faced a lot of surprises in the recent couple of weeks. First, the low capabilities of Russian army, which clearly seem to be not so much ready for a real combat, as Putin's generals had reported to him. Second, of course, the degree of Ukrainian resistance is a huge surprise to everyone in Moscow. If you only watched Russian TV propaganda shows of the past few months, they have been essentially mocking the Ukrainian army, basically translating the message from the Kremlin. And yet another issue is the severity of Western sanctions, which are crushing Russian economy even as we speak. I also think that was not expected neither by Putin nor by his inner circle.
I wanted to ask you about how effective you think those sanctions are or will be.
We're actually back to the late Soviet times when we really did not have food in stores, basic supplies in stores. You probably remember all these pictures with empty shelves of Soviet grocery stores. We're going back there. We're going to, several dozen percentage point inflation. We already have shortages of basic food and consumer goods supplies in many Russian regions, but this is just the beginning. I think in 2, 3, 4 weeks' time, we'll experience an economic shock that is comparable only to the period of 1989-91, the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And do you think that will apply the necessary pressure to Putin?
Yes, because he doesn't have tools to fight with his difficulties. He really believed in his rainy day fund, the financial reserves of the Ministry of Finance and the central bank, which have been effectively blocked by the G7 sanctions against Russian central bank assets. He can't use that now. Basically, the only way out for him is to print money, which leads to hyperinflation, as we all know from the experience of early 90s. So he doesn't have many options on the table to contain this economic tsunami that is coming. And I know from a lot of my former colleagues who are still at the state service that there were no contingency plan. They were not prepared for this level of severity of Western financial and economic response. There is little they can offer, Putin's government can offer in return.
You're obviously, given your former role as Deputy Minister of Energy, familiar with the significance of energy to the Russian economy. The U.S. and Canada have blocked imports of oil and gas from Russia. Europe is far more reliant and has been far more reluctant to do so. Do you think that in any way negates the potential impact of sanctions, or will they still be as effective as hoped?
No, that will double down on the economic effects for Putin from Western sanctions. Already before the US and Canada had announced Russian oil and gas embargo, there has been voluntary restrictions imposed by traders, refiners, shippers all over the world. In the first couple of weeks since the beginning of aggression against Ukraine, Russia had lost about a third of its daily crude and petroleum product exports because of the voluntary self-imposed restrictions by market players. Now this is even going to increase further. So Putin's going to lose a lot of cash because of all these different restrictive measures that will definitely not help him to weather through these extremely challenging times.
You note, and many others have as well, that the West's response has been severe and unified. I wonder, though, if your sense is that they didn't think he would do what he's done.
Well, there has been some reports, intelligence assessments that Putin's full-scale aggression against Ukraine is possible. And, you know, the swiftness with which the Western sanctions were introduced, the incredible coordination in all these measures tells us that the Western governments were like more or less prepared for this scenario. They were not caught absolutely unprepared for this. But generally, I think the predominant mood would still that Putin would refrain from this most extreme scenarios, which means that with all these negative predictions materializing, we can unfortunately expect more bad stuff from him, which requires applying even more pressure, doubling down on pressure to contain his potential malign actions in the future.
What does more pressure look like? And when you say expect more from him, do you mean going beyond the borders of Ukraine?
Yes, and I really expect a direct military confrontation between Putin and NATO countries. I think we should not treat this emotionally, but we should calmly prepare for that sort of possibility, which to me looks like a prevailing certainty at the moment, over 50% chance.
Why do you have that sense that it's over 50% chance? Because that I just want to emphasize that for a second. You know, we're a NATO country. There's been this delineation offered by many politicians. We're not going to do a no-fly zone because it's not a NATO country that has been attacked yet. Why? Tell me why, if you can, you have that sense that Putin will go that far.
Because in the mind of Putin's elite, this is not just a propaganda cliche that they are translating. They do not really believe that there's an independent government in Ukraine. They believe that Ukraine is a West client state. So essentially, they already believe that they're at war with the West. They're absolutely angered with Western response to Russian aggression. They really want to punish Western countries. So I'm currently speaking to you from Vilnius, Lithuania. I very seriously assess, for instance, the possibility that Putin will attack one way or another the Baltic countries, either through acts of sabotage or directly. There is also an increased great possibility of an accident, because Putin's planes, missiles are flying in very close proximity to NATO borders. So that type of accidents might lead to escalation. There are plenty of options, but the bottom line is that Putin's ruling elite views this war as actually the war with the West and Ukraine as Western proxy, which means that one way or another, it's very reasonable to expect that they will step over and move further in retaliation to all these serious restrictive measures that the West have been taking against Putin's regime recently.
And just before I let you go, Mr. Milov, when you say for Western countries not to be, I think you used the word emotional, but to kind of prepare for it, what does that mean?
That means the scenario should be on the table. None of the containment options, none of the confrontation scenarios should be excluded. I don't want to scare anybody, but listen, 9 years ago, one of Putin's close allies, Dmitry Rogozin, who is now head of the Russian Space Agency, had spoken with a lecture which was titled "Russia would lose a war to America in 6 hours," where Rogozin actually laid out all the strategic weaknesses of the Russian military. So I think Putin wants to scare the West, to intimidate the West, to create him advantage on this global geopolitical battlefield. I think the main issue is to demonstrate that nobody is scared, and the response for various scenarios, however undesired, is still there, and the response will be swift and will be very severe, will have important consequences for Putin.
Mr. Milov, thank you very much for your insights. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.
Turn now to Luke Schrago, our reporter who's live there. Luke, thanks so much for being with us. Airfields in that part of the country now frequent targets of Russian bombings. How's the Ukrainian military holding up where you are now?
Well, since the war's outbreak with Russia, Ukraine has consistently been calling for aid. They have managed to put up this stiff resistance, but the Russians do have more advanced technology, more advanced systems, and they have more of them. That's not been helped by, during the initial days, Russia's initial attack really targeted Ukraine's defensive and offensive capabilities, targeting airfields and sites, military bases across the country. This Air Force spokesperson was speaking to us, and he told us that any choice to help is now in the West's hands. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Ukraine receives different weapons. It's been made public. NLAW anti-tank weapons from Great Britain, Javelin missiles from the USA, and German weaponry too. We're talking about anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons that can reach 4.5 kilometers in height and 6 kilometers in range. Now we're negotiating with our partners about much more powerful weaponry, aircraft and anti-aircraft systems. We want to show that if they don't provide it to us, Ukraine will be destroyed. Without a strong Ukraine, there'll be no strong Europe.
Now, all of this comes amid even further calls for what people here are calling to close the sky. That's set up a no-fly zone that they have been consistently demanding for some time now.
So Venezia, where you are, is now closer to armed conflict than at any other point in the past few weeks when this invasion began. What's the mood where you are right now?
Well, Venezia sits on this crossroads, as it were, in central Ukraine. It's become this incredibly important route for those fleeing the conflict and the displaced to move towards the west and at least relative safety, mostly heading towards the town of Lviv, where they're hoping to cross the border into Poland and the European Union. We've seen successive waves of displaced head this way, and while the city is at a standstill at this point, many businesses are closed with only essential businesses operating. Life is still soldiering on. Sirens are a consistent feature. We hear several every day, and there is a certain sense of suspicion in the air. There have been these reports of Russian agents operating behind the lines. Every time that we go out into the field to do reporting, every time we stop for a live, we are accosted and stopped by at least 2 or 3 people every single time who are asking what we're doing here. One notable case involved the police arriving about an hour after we were stopped to request information and check on who we actually were, who they'd been reported of us being. Now, most people coming through here, they're not staying very long. They're only staying for a single night to rest up before they move on. The mayor of the city is giving people shelter and aid as needed. There are a few staying a little bit more long term, but he is determined to soldier on, and but he is in no doubt as to the seriousness of the situation, and he has vowed to defend his city with this palpable sense of tension in the air.
Luke Shrego reporting there from Venezia.
This afternoon, Ukraine's president said that Russia would have to carpet bomb the Ukrainian capital and kill its residents if it wanted to take the city. There's continued to be heavy shelling in Mariupol, where the city's deputy mayor pleaded for people to be allowed out and for aid to come in. President Zelensky has demanded the release of Melitopol's mayor, saying that CCTV footage showed him being kidnapped by Russian soldiers. Fighting near Kyiv has intensified, with Russian forces said to be edging closer to the capital. For the first time, President Zelensky put a figure on the number of Ukrainian military personnel who've been killed since the invasion began. 1,300, he said. And the warning, my report does contain some distressing images. The letter Z has lost its innocence. Russia's symbol of war, now a symbol of terror. This is Mariupol, and call this vandalism by heavy armor. What did this block of flats ever do to get shelled? Or this tire repair shop? Mariupol is guilty of not falling to the Russians. But it's easier to destroy buildings than to destroy the spirit of people fighting for their home. These Ukrainian troops are refusing to give up. And the government acknowledged today that they'd lost 1,300 soldiers so far. But the heaviest price, as ever, is paid by those who cannot fight back. And who cannot find refuge in a war in which hospitals are targets. Civilians streamed into a war today that is familiar to anyone who paid attention during the Syrian war. Anastasia is inconsolable. She lost one of her children in the shelling.
Пришли к брату. Все вместе. Что мне так страшно было. Спустились в подвал с детьми, женщины с детьми спустились в подвал. И прилетел снаряд во двор. Нас засыпало в погребе. Двоих детей они спасли.
What words can do this justice? On the road to Mariupol is Volnovakha, a glimpse of the hell to come. The drone footage is silent, which is just as well, because this is now a dead landscape, rendered lifeless by Russian armour. Tanks parked where there should be cars. Church without spire. Bathtub as a fire pit. To the victors, the spoils. The longer it takes Russia to occupy parts of Ukraine, the more it turns all this uninhabitable. An act of vengeance for a war not going to plan, but by no means lost. This was Russian government footage of troops near Kyiv. One wonders what they've been told with their orders. Is it to wrong the rights of a Russia more sinned against than sinning? Do they really feel like victims of Western aggression? What do they truly think they're fighting for in the unwelcoming fields of Ukraine? Or, for that matter, dying for? We don't know where or how Senior Lieutenant Denis Sokolov died during the war that Russia still calls a special military operation. But in the city of Perm, his home, he leaves behind a wife and 2 children, one of them just a few months old. A family who, at this moment, will probably feel the same pain as their Ukrainian counterparts. But they do know what they're fighting for. The Ukrainian citizens of occupied Melitopol converging on the town hall, shouting, "Bring back our mayor." Here kidnapped by Russian officers who put a bag over his head. Mayor Ivan Fedorov had refused to follow Russian orders and is now missing. It's the kind of rough justice that Ukrainians don't want to live under. Vladimir Putin may question the right of this nation to exist, but with every shell he's making the case for them. Their identity is being forged on the anvil of war. And sung by the opera company of Odessa, a city preparing for a siege. A national anthem once unknown outside Ukraine is now ringing in the world's ears. Now, President Zelensky continues to run his besieged and fractured country from the government quarter in Kyiv. He even gave a press conference today and went on a coffee run. And the capital feels the Russian noose tightening around its neck, with troops advancing slowly but relentlessly. When the siege begins in earnest, it may become the most dramatic, bloody and drawn-out siege since World War II. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, has been to Brovary, 20 miles northeast of Kyiv, and is in the capital for us now. Lindsay.
Matt, in the last few minutes, we've been hearing the rumble of artillery, probably about 15 or 20 miles away to the northwest, and a small amount of small arms fire as well. Now, there were quite a lot of overnight strikes on the outskirts, including at an airfield and an ammunition depot at a place called Vasilkiv, which is to the southwest. But what we saw was not like that. That is very much a military target, but we went out to the northeast, as you mentioned, to Brovary, and what we saw that had been hit was a food warehouse. Now, this is very significant. The Russians have some form in this. When they were working with the Syrians in Syria, they destroyed food in the fields.